The wind howled through the barren trees, a relentless, biting force that seemed determined to peel the warmth from the world. The sky hung low and heavy, a washed-out gray that mirrored the cracked asphalt beneath his feet. It was one of those winter days where even the simplest tasks felt like an endurance test. He hunched his shoulders against the icy gusts as he stepped out of the car, his arms laden with grocery bags. Stephen had just finished his morning routine of dropping his 3 boys off at school before running errands. Now, as he approached his modest home, a growing sense of unease gnawed at the edges of his mind. He chalked it up to the wind, something he never quite enjoyed. It was a constant roar punctuated by sharp, unpredictable gusts that seemed to pierce the fabric of his jacket, sinking icy fingers into his skin. The chaotic noise grated on his senses, a sensory overload that made him yearn for the quiet sanctuary of the indoors. He quickened his pace, eager to escape the unrelenting wind. But as he reached the path leading to his front door, something strange happened. A sound, faint and fleeting, seemed to thread through the cacophony of the bustling branches of the wind-whipped trees. It was a whisper, a soft call of his name. Stephen? He froze mid-step, his pulse quickening. The sound wasn't just noise carried by the wind. It felt intentional. Like a far-off echo, yet impossibly close, brushing against his ear. He turned sharply, scanning the yard and the empty street beyond. No one was there. Only the wind, hissing and snapping at the skeletal branches of the ancient oak tree that towered over his yard. "Hello?" he called, his voice swallowed almost instantly by the storm. He waited, but there was no reply, only the voice of the biting wind. Shaking his head, he dismissed the unease as a trick of his mind, a fleeting auditory illusion conjured by exhaustion and the chaotic noise. He adjusted the grocery bags in his arms and took another step toward the door. That's when it happened. A deafening crack split the air like a gunshot. Stephen instinctively flinched, his heart slamming against his ribs. He turned just in time to see one of the massive branches of the oak tree splinter and fall, hurtling downward with terrifying speed. It crashed to the ground with a thunderous boom, sending up a spray of snow and debris. For a long moment, Stephen stood motionless, staring at the massive branch now sprawled across his front porch. His mind struggled to process what had just happened. The branch was so large that it covered the exact spot he would have been standing had he not paused, had he not heard his name whispered on the wind. A shiver ran down his spine, and it wasn't from the cold. He took a shaky step back, his breath visible in short, uneven bursts. Something about this moment felt off. Not random. Not natural. He looked around again, scanning the empty yard and street, his unease deepening. "Stephen?" The whisper came again, softer this time, barely audible over the wind. It wasn't menacing, but it wasn't comforting either. It felt like a hand reaching out to him from the unknown, from something just beyond the edges of his understanding. He didn't know what to think. All he knew was that he was alive and he shouldn't be. Whatever had called his name, whatever had made him pause, had saved his life. And for the first time, he wondered if the unease he had been feeling all day wasn't from the wind at all. Perhaps it was something or someone trying to get through to him. Stephen, unsure of what to do next, stood for another moment next to the splintered branch that should have killed him. Gone were the icy wisps of the wind that had cut through his clothing. He now suddenly felt heat pouring out of the collar of his shirt, his heart still pounding in his ears and against his ribs. He shifted the groceries in his arms, once again aware that he was holding them. Confident that he hadn't imagined hearing his name, he spoke aloud once again to the voice on the wind. "Thank you." He spoke to the emptiness around him that he no longer believed to be truly empty. He then spoke the 2 words in his mind just in the event that his name had been called from within. Stephen began to work his way around the branch that had fallen in front of his door, still needing to enter his home when a second unexpected word was whispered, this time much more clear and distinct. "Welcome." The sound of his groceries hitting the ground, having been dropped out of his arms, snapped him back to his reality that he had momentarily strayed from. He gathered them up and continued inside, putting them away and then deciding to take a hot shower to clear his obviously exhausted mind. Stephen stepped into the shower, the coolness of the tiles a stark contrast to the turbulent thoughts racing through his mind. He turned the knob, and the hot water cascaded down onto the top of his head, the sound and sensation almost drowning out the storm of confusion swirling in his mind. He closed his eyes, letting the warm water run over his face, hoping it would wash away the uncertainty, the fear, the sense of something bigger once again tugging at the edge of his mind as it had done most of his life. The steam began to fill the small bathroom, but the more the steam filled the room, the more he felt something else, something strange yet familiar. At first he thought it was just the mist, the way it clung to the air and softened the edges of the world. But as it thickened, he felt a presence, a form slowly taking shape in the haze. A woman. She moved gracefully as if the steam itself was her body, shifting and curling around her like a delicate wisp of smoke. Her silhouette flickered, translucent yet somehow distinct. The room seemed to hum with an energy that made the air heavier, more alive. His heart thudded in his chest, a strange mix of recognition and disbelief. Without thinking, Stephen reached out, his fingers trembling. He touched the mist, and instantly the sensation was different. The steam solidified, and a delicate hand, soft, warm, and real, found his intertwining with his own. He felt the warmth of her touch, the pressure of her grip. The world around him seemed to pause for a moment, the water no longer beating down on him, and then the clarity hit him like a bolt of lightning. Her form, once ethereal and shifting, became tangible in his mind. He could see her, every detail, every curve of her face, every strand of hair that danced in the mist. But it wasn't just her appearance that became clear. It was her essence, her name. He had always known her name. Sarah. He whispered, the words slipping from his lips like it had always been there, waiting to be spoken. Her eyes, deep and knowing, locked onto his. He could see the shape of her form, her long dark hair, the warmth of her beauty, her pointed ears that wiggled, rotating slightly towards him. There was no surprise, no fear in her gaze, just an unspoken understanding. She had always been there, even if he hadn't known until now. As the water continued to pour over him, the room filled with an overwhelming sense of familiarity and an undeniable connection that was as real as the heat from the water. The mist wrapped around him, comforting and surreal, as though he was no longer just a man, but part of something far older, far deeper. Sarah smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips, and in that moment, Stephen realized that whatever had brought her here, magic or fate or whatever this was, it was no accident. It was something meant to be, but also something that had always been. She was the thing that lived at the edge of his mind. The something that was always there but frustratingly never defined or reachable. "Hello, Stephen," she said, not breaking eye contact and taking his hand into both of hers. The water continued to flow, its rhythmic sound filling the space around them, but Stephen was barely aware of it now. His focus was entirely on the woman standing before him, her presence now impossibly real, like a living dream woven into the steam. Her hands felt warm wrapped around his, almost electric, and her gaze never wavered. "Sarah," he whispered again, the name feeling like both a memory and a discovery, as if it was something he had always known and yet never fully understood. She smiled softly, her eyes holding an ancient sorrow and a tenderness that both soothed and unsettled him. "You are confused," she said, her voice lilting like a melody, yet there was an underlying weight to it, as though centuries of knowledge were carried within each word. "I know this, Stephen. But this is a story you have to hear. A truth you've never been told." He nodded, his mind racing with questions, but something about her presence, the quiet power in her eyes, the weight of her words, kept him rooted in place, like he was meant to hear this. She continued, her hands still clasped around his, the connection between them pulsing softly. "I am an elf," she said gently, the words as if she had whispered them in his mind long before now, and he had only just begun to listen. "From a dimension that rests atop yours, unseen, woven into the fabric of your world but hidden from your eyes. It has been this way for eons." Stephen's breath caught in his throat. "An elf?" he repeated, the words both strange and familiar. "But how? Why?" Sarah's smile deepened, her fingers tracing the back of his hand with a tender, almost affectionate touch. "Because you and I have always been connected, Stephen. From the moment you first took breath, we were linked in a way that has not happened in centuries. His heart seemed to skip a beat as her words settled into his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but she pressed a soft and warm finger against his lips, silencing him gently. You don't remember, but we shared that first breath long ago. When you were born, I was there too, being born in my world. My first breath was your first breath. My spirit and yours intertwined unknowingly in a moment of life that bridged our worlds. And since then I have whispered to you, watched you. Through your joys, your sorrows, your pain, and your heartbreak, I've always been there, a part of you, unseen but present. Stephen's mind reeled with what she was saying. A part of him wanted to deny it, but another part, one deep down, in a place he hadn't known existed or never acknowledged, felt the truth of her words stir in his very bones. Why couldn't I hear you? He asked, his voice hoarse, his grip tightening around her hand. All these years, all my life feeling like there was something beside me, hidden in nothing. Why didn't you reach me sooner? Sarah's gaze softened, her expression filled with a sadness that mirrored his own in ways he couldn't explain. I have tried, Stephen. For decades I have tried to speak to you, to reach you. But your world, your thoughts, your fears, your doubts kept me from breaking through. The noise of your life was too much. You were not ready, not until today. His chest tightened, the weight of her words sinking deep within him. What do you mean? What's different now? Because, she began, her voice trembling ever so slightly, you were about to die. The words were like a blow to the chest. His mind went blank, a wave of cold panic crashing over him. What? What are you talking about? Sarah's eyes held his, an intensity in them that made him feel as though she could see all of him, everything he had ever been and ever would be. I felt it, Stephen. The moment your body, your soul, teetered on the edge. The pain of losing you was unbearable, and I knew you wouldn't survive that branch, not without this connection. Not without me. Stephen's heart raced. You're saying I was going to die? And you? Stephen trailed off, letting his words fall like the water around him. I couldn't let that happen, she finished, her voice firm but tender. So I reached through. I found a way to break through the barrier between our worlds. And now here I am, as I've always been, trying to save you. To save us both. For the first time in his life, Stephen felt the weight of something much bigger than himself pressing down on him. The feeling of connection, of being seen and understood, like a part of him had always been missing and now, inexplicably, was found. Sarah moved closer. You're not alone, she whispered, her voice barely a breath against his ear. And you will never be alone again. You, me, your three boys, we are all connected now. The veil that separated our worlds has once again been pierced. You and I together. If you want. Without hesitation, Stephen pulled her into his arms, hugging her tightly, feeling the warmth of her body pressed against him, a feeling that felt more right to him than anything he had ever experienced, save for holding each of his sons. Sarah squeezed him tighter, merging their worlds closer as their connection bridged what should have never been separated. The two embraced as the human and elf worlds became one. Dimensions pressed together and merged. Forests popped up in the open spaces the human world long ago cleared. The hidden elf world appeared as it suddenly became tangible in the human realm. Sarah laughed in his ear, shifting her hug to his other side. You are naked and wet, she said, now being able to see much more of the surroundings. I have never seen everything around you before, just the connections to your thoughts and emotions and sometimes glimpses of you. Stephen pulled back and realized Sarah had not been getting wet while standing in the shower with him, but her skin and dress were now becoming soaked. Something had changed when he had hugged her. He felt it but now understood it. She was no longer just connected to him in some ethereal way. She was real, alive, flesh and blood, and in the shower with him. He picked her up and spun around in the shower, putting her into the warm water. She laughed even harder, having never before taken a hot shower in this manner. This is wonderful, she said through her laughter. We usually bathe in a stream or a lake. Stephen smiled, witnessing her enthusiasm. He noted how her laugh filled his insides with joy in a way he had rarely felt. Should we get out? Stephen asked with a chuckle. I don't want to ruin your dress. Sarah tugged at the string in the top of her dress and it opened as it slipped gently over her shoulders and down her body. She scooped it up with her foot and pushed it out of the shower with a wet plop on the bathroom floor. There, she said and tilted her face into the stream of hot water. She stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, taking in the new sensations. Stephen glanced at her elven form and realized how stunning her shape was. She was perfect in his eyes. Sarah opened her eyes and caught Stephen looking. He sheepishly looked away and said, "I am sorry, I didn't mean to look. Just the first time an elf materializes in my shower." "Don't be sorry," she said, looking him up and down as well. "This is nothing but comfortable for me. I have known you all my life." She smiled, taking his hands and looking deep into his eyes once again. "I can't imagine any better place to be than right here with you." She bit her lower lip softly and enticingly stared at his lips. Stephen, catching the cue, pulled her close and kissed her soft lips. The connection between them sent sparks through each. They had each had other relationships that ended badly because this was the moment both of them had been hoping for their whole lives. The kiss sealed the connection not only between them but between the elf and human worlds as well. The moments of their lives passed through each of their minds as this connection took hold, uniting them in memory and thought and something deeper that neither could explain. It was the most right thing that had happened to a man and woman in the last 1,000 years. Fate and Kismet both directing these two to this moment. The kiss broke slowly. Sarah and Stephen's foreheads rested against one another as the feeling of what just occurred washed over them in waves. Bodies pressed against one another in the warmth of the water. Sarah felt that Stephen had very much enjoyed the kiss, both through her mind connection and the feeling of his body pressed against her. She looked down and then up into his eyes alluringly, seeing Stephen suddenly blush, realizing what was about to happen. His smile grew from ear to ear, however, as she winked her approval. The passion that erupted between them lasted for hours and through many parts of the house, including one brief moment on the stairs before that poor decision was hurriedly changed to the bedroom. In the naked afterglow of the late morning events, Sarah and Stephen lay entwined together on his king-size bed. The kissing had become soft and gentle following its peak passion and ferocity at the culmination of their activity. Stephen gently ran his finger along the curve of Sarah's pointed ear. He had never seen anything quite so mesmerizing in his life. He felt a warmth and happiness that came from a place so deep in him that it had never been felt before. "I think you are perfect," Stephen said when he caught the dark eyes of Sarah watching him. "You are what I have always wanted. You are exactly what my exes weren't. You aren't going to leave, are you?" Sarah thought for a moment and then sighed. "I don't know. I don't want to leave, but our worlds are separate, and I am not even sure how this day was possible. I would much rather stay with you here. It's dangerous in my world. There are angry creatures that hunt my kind. They have kept our numbers so few that I was afraid there would be no more of us in a matter of years. This is the most safe I have ever felt." As if on cue, a deep and close howl punctuated the air. Sarah sat up in the bed, shivering down to her core. No, not here. Not now. She ran to the window and saw her forest, the one from her world, covering the distance westward. The green leaves popping in stark contrast to the bare winter trees that were scattered amongst them. Intermixed into the woods were the roofs of human houses. She came to the understanding at the same time as Stephen, who had been standing behind her, also looking out the window. "Our worlds have merged," they said in unison, partially because of their connection and partially because it was the only possible truth. The soft winter's afternoon light bathed Stephen's room, the misty remnants of his encounter with Sarah still fresh in his mind as she stood before him, her gaze fixed out the window, her otherworldly beauty both mesmerizing and beautiful in the dim light. Below them, at the edge of the newly emerged forest, a lush expanse that had somehow fused into the mundane cul-de-sac, shadows twisted unnaturally among the towering trees still swaying in the dying wind. Then, from the darkness, it emerged. A wolf. But this was no ordinary wolf. Its massive frame dwarfed even the largest wolf Stephen had ever imagined. Its fur shimmered, dark as midnight but streaked with faint silver patterns that seemed to pulse and shift like starlight. Its eyes burned a deep, primal gold, scanning the air with unnerving intelligence. The beast sniffed, its movements deliberate and predatory, its snout twitching as it caught a scent. Sarah tensed beside him, her grip on his arm tightening. "No," she whispered, her voice filled with a dread that sent shivers down Stephen's spine. "What is it?" Stephen asked, his voice low, his heart pounding in his chest. "A shadow-bound sentinel," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. "It's a hunter, one of the few creatures capable of tracking my kind. It must have come along when the forest crossed into this world." The wolf's head snapped toward them. Its nostrils flared, and for a moment, the street below seemed to hold its breath. Then, with terrifying speed, the creature charged. Stephen stumbled back from the window. "It's coming right at us." Sarah's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything. "Stephen, listen to me. This creature isn't just a wolf. It's a force of nature, bound to the ancient laws of my world. It won't stop until—" A deafening crash reverberated through the air as the wolf launched itself into the side of the house. The walls groaned under its immense weight as it clawed its way upward. "Upstairs isn't safe," Sarah said, her voice sharp with urgency. "We have to." The wolf's massive head appeared at the window, its golden eyes blazing as it locked onto them. With a feral snarl, it lunged forward, shattering the glass and sending shards flying into the room. Stephen instinctively threw himself to the floor, shielding his face from the spray of debris. The wolf's enormous frame forced its way through the broken window, its powerful limbs crushing furniture beneath it as it growled, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very air. Sarah stepped forward, her hand glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Her voice was steady, though her face betrayed a flicker of fear. "Stay back, Stephen." The wolf snarled, lowering its head as it prepared to strike. Its golden eyes flickered between Sarah and Stephen, and then, with terrifying swiftness, it pounced. With a blur of shadow and starlight it flew, its jaws snapping open to strike. Time seemed to slow, the air thick with the scent of blood and pine. Sarah shouted something. Stephen couldn't hear the words over the rush of adrenaline that coursed through him. Without thinking, he stepped in between her and the beast, his body moving faster than his mind could process. The impact was brutal. Stephen's hands caught the wolf's massive head as it charged, the force of the collision sending all three of them crashing to the floor. The wolf's snarls filled his ears, its hot breath searing his face, and its claws raked across his chest, tearing through flesh and tissue alike. Pain flared white-hot, but something deeper, something primal, surged through him. "Stephen, run!" Sarah screamed, her voice raw with desperation. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. A brute strength he didn't know he possessed took hold. With a guttural roar of defiance, he shifted his grip, his fingers digging into the wolf's fur and flesh. Using every ounce of his strength, he wrenched its massive head to the side with a sickening crack. The wolf's body went limp, its golden eyes fading into stillness. Stephen collapsed into the floor, blood pouring from the deep gashes across his torso. His vision blurred, the room spinning around him as pain overwhelmed his senses. He barely registered Sarah's frantic voice, calling his name over and over. "Stephen. No, no, no." Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed them against his wounds, trying to stop the bleeding. Tears streaked her face, her composure shattered. "This can't happen. Not now." Her hands began to glow, a soft, golden light emanating from her palms. Stephen's pain dulled slightly as the light grew brighter, warmer, surrounding them both in an almost celestial glow. Sarah's face twisted in concentration, her voice trembling as she muttered words in a language Stephen didn't recognize. "This isn't possible, it hasn't happened in 1,000 years, she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I have to try. For you." The light from her hands intensified, spreading across Stephen's torn torso. The gashes began to close, the torn flesh knitting together as though time itself was reversing. Stephen gasped, the sensation like a rush of warmth and life flooding into his body. He blinked, his vision clearing as the glow began to fade. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the aftermath of the battle. Stephen's chest still rose and fell rapidly, the memory of the wolf's claws and the fire of Sarah's healing touch vivid in his mind. But as he glanced toward the lifeless body of the massive wolf, something strange began to happen. The creature's fur rippled as though caught in an unseen wind. Its massive form shimmered, the silver streaks in its coat glowing faintly before fading entirely. Slowly, the wolf began to dissolve into a swirling black mist, its edges curling and dissipating like smoke caught in a draft. The mist hovered for a moment, almost sentient, before it thinned and vanished into the ether. Stephen and Sarah stared at the empty space where the beast had been. Neither spoke, the weight of the moment too immense for words. Stephen turned to her, his gaze searching her face. Her skin was still pale from exhaustion, her features a mix of wonder and fear. "Your hands," Stephen said softly, his voice almost reverent. "You healed me, Sarah. That was... I don't even know how to describe it." Sarah looked down at her trembling hands, flexing her fingers as though they didn't quite feel real. "I didn't think it was possible," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "That power was lost to my people. But something about you, no, something about us, brought it back." Stephen's heart raced, his emotions a storm he couldn't control. Without thinking, he reached out, cupping her face in his hands. "You saved my life," he murmured, his voice thick with gratitude. "And I don't think I've ever been more grateful for anything." Stephen pulled her to him once more. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, but quickly deepened, a connection that felt as though it had been destined across lifetimes. For a brief moment, the chaos of the last few moments faded, replaced by the warmth of their shared breath and the electric spark of something both wanted to enjoy forever. But reality crashed back into Stephen's mind like a lightning strike. He pulled back abruptly, his breath catching in his throat. "My kids," he said, panic flooding his voice. "If that thing found us here, what if it went after them?" Sarah's eyes sharpened, her exhaustion giving way to alertness. "Then we need to find them," she said, her voice steady despite the urgency. Stephen scrambled to his feet, pulling open his dresser drawers and tossing clothes toward Sarah. "Here," he said, grabbing a pair of jeans and a hoodie. "Put these on. We need to blend in." Sarah took the clothes, glancing at them curiously before nodding. She turned away, quickly pulling on the oversized hoodie and adjusting the jeans, which were slightly too big but would do. Stephen grabbed his jacket, checked his phone for any messages from the school, and then grabbed his car keys. "Let's go," he said, his voice resolute. Sarah followed him down the stairs, her movements fluid despite the unfamiliar clothing. The two of them stepped outside into the cool night air, the distant hum of crickets contrasting with the surreal events they just endured. Stephen's car was parked in the driveway, and they climbed in without hesitation. As they sped toward the school, Stephen's knuckles turned white against the steering wheel. "Do you think more of those things came too?" he asked, glancing at Sarah. She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "The two worlds collided," she said quietly. "Anything could happen now. But whatever comes, we'll face it together." Stephen tightened his grip on the wheel, his mind racing. Whatever had happened, whatever this was, he knew one thing for certain. He would protect his kids and he would protect Sarah no matter what it took. Sarah held onto the armrests with her eyes tightly closed, scared of the movement of the car. The school parking lot was chaotic. Parents hurriedly gathered their children, many of them shouting and crying, while teachers tried in vain to maintain order. Stephen pulled into the lot, scanning the crowd desperately until he spotted his boys standing near their teacher, looking confused but unharmed. Stephen threw the car into park and leapt out. Sarah followed close behind him after a moment of trying to open the unfamiliar door. Relief washed over him when he saw the boys' familiar faces, their expressions a mix of curiosity and worry. "Dad," the youngest, Jamie, called out, his small hand waving energetically. Stephen crouched and wrapped all three of them in a tight hug as soon as he reached them. "You're okay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're all okay." "What's going on?" his middle son Ryan asked, frowning. "Why does the playground look like a forest? And why's everyone freaking out?" Stephen pulled back and looked toward the playground. The boys weren't exaggerating, the once familiar slides and swings were now surrounded by towering trees with glowing leaves, their roots breaking through the asphalt. The air shimmered faintly as if the forest itself were alive. "I'll explain everything in the car," Stephen said, glancing nervously at Sarah. She lingered a few feet behind, her posture tense as she scanned the area. The boys climbed into the back seat, still firing off questions, while Stephen helped Sarah into the front. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle as if it might bite her. "Are you sure this thing is safe?" she asked, eyeing the car with suspicion. "As safe as it gets," Stephen said, offering her a reassuring smile. "Just trust me." Sarah nodded and climbed in, sitting stiffly and gripping the door for balance as Stephen started the engine. The rumble made her jump once more, and she muttered something under her breath in her native tongue. In the back, Jamie stared at Sarah, his wide eyes unblinking. "I know you," he said suddenly. Sarah turned, her expression softening. "Do you now?" she asked gently. Jamie nodded. "I've seen you before in my dreams, I think. And when I was little, you were there. I could see you." Stephen glanced at Sarah, his eyebrows raising. "Is that possible?" Sarah nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "Young children often see through the veil," she explained. "Before they grow older and the weight of this world clouds their vision." Jamie grinned, satisfied with her answer, while his brothers exchanged confused looks. The drive back home was eerily quiet, the boys sensing the seriousness of the situation. When they arrived, Stephen ushered everyone inside and locked the door behind them. Sarah seemed more relaxed indoors, though her eyes still darted to the windows as if expecting another wolf to burst through at any moment. "All right, let's see if we can figure out what's happening," Stephen said, grabbing the remote and turning on the TV. The screen flickered to life, the news already in full panic mode. A breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom as a grim-faced anchor read from a report. "Reports are coming in from across the globe," the anchor said, his voice steady but tense. "Forests have appeared in major cities and rural areas alike, seemingly out of nowhere. These otherworldly landscapes are accompanied by creatures, some sort of wolves like the ones seen here in this footage, attacking humans. Authorities have successfully killed several of these creatures, though the origins of these attacks remain unknown." The camera cut to shaky footage of a massive wolf, eerily similar to the one Stephen had killed, snarling and lunging at a group of armed men. The screen then showed images of the newly formed forests, their glowing trees and ethereal beauty captivating and terrifying in equal measure. The anchor's voice continued, "In addition to the creatures, there are reports of humanoid figures with pointed ears, described as resembling elves from folklore, appearing near these forests. Experts are still investigating whether these beings are connected to the mysterious phenomenon." Stephen turned to Sarah, his heart pounding. "They're talking about you," he said softly. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "It's only the beginning," she murmured. "Our worlds have collided. And nothing will ever be the same again. So you are staying?" Stephen asked with a hopeful expression on his face. "You want me to?" Sarah replied. "Short answer yes, long answer oh hell yes," Stephen said. Sarah laughed and pulled the hood back from over her ears. Stephen's oldest son Nathan glanced up in surprise. "Cool ears," he said, and went back to searching his phone for news about what was happening. The sun hung high in the sky, its golden rays filtering through the now familiar shimmer of the elven forest that bordered the human town. 5 months had passed since the day the worlds collided, and life had found a delicate balance between the two. Elves, once thought to exist only in myth, now walked openly among humans, their presence an odd but welcome addition to society. Of the 473 elves who had crossed over, many had begun forging bonds with humans, teaching, marrying, and sharing their ancient wisdom. The wolves, however, were another story. Humanity had hunted down nearly all of them, leaving only a few to roam the farthest reaches of the wild lands, far from prying eyes. Peace, fragile and tentative, had returned to the human world. Stephen's house, repaired and renewed after the wolf attack, stood as a quiet sanctuary. The scars on its walls and in its occupants' memories remained, but they were a reminder of survival, of love, and of the strength they'd found together. Inside, Stephen was bustling around the living room, helping his sons pack for their first camping trip. Sleeping bags, lanterns, and a ridiculous amount of snacks were being crammed into backpacks by 3 very enthusiastic boys. Jamie, the youngest, was the most excited, hopping from one foot to the other as he showed Sarah his carefully packed flashlight. "Look, Sarah. It's really bright," he said, clicking it on and waving it around. Sarah chuckled, crouching down to inspect his bag. "I see that, Jamie. You've packed well." A good light is important in the woods, especially at night. Ryan wrinkled his nose as he stuffed another bag of chips into his pack. Are we really sleeping in tents? No Wi-Fi? No TV? Exactly, Sarah said with a grin, adjusting the hem of the shirt she'd borrowed from Stephen. Over the past few months, she'd grown more accustomed to human clothing, but she still missed the flow of elven garments. You'll learn how to listen to the forest, how to see with your other senses. The trees have much to teach if you're quiet enough to hear them. Stephen walked over, zipping up a bag. You'll survive, Ryan. Besides, I think Sarah's got some pretty cool lessons planned. Nathan, the eldest, slung his pack over his shoulder, trying to hide his excitement. I'm just glad school's out. Sarah smiled warmly, standing and placing a hand on Stephen's arm. The forest will be good for all of us. As they loaded the car, Jamie paused, his small face lighting up. Are you and Dad going to share a tent? Stephen nearly dropped the cooler he was carrying. Jamie, let's focus on getting packed. Sarah laughed softly, her cheeks warming as she walked over to help Stephen. Children have an uncanny way of seeing through things, she whispered, her dark green eyes sparkling. Later, as the car rumbled down the road toward the forest, the boys' chatter filled the space. Sarah sat beside Stephen, her hand resting lightly on his. Her gaze drifted to the horizon, where the trees seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, the heart of her former world still alive within them. When they arrived at the campsite, Stephen and the boys set to work pitching tents and gathering firewood. Sarah wandered a little way into the forest, the cool earth beneath her feet grounding her as she closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The faint hum of the veil still lingered, a connection between the two worlds that only she could feel. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the fire crackled, Stephen pulled Sarah aside, holding her hands. His boys were roasting marshmallows, their laughter echoing through the trees. Sarah, he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. These past few months, you've changed everything. I don't know how I got so lucky, but I know I don't want to live another day without you. He knelt down, pulling a small ring from his pocket. It wasn't fancy, just a simple silver band, but it shimmered faintly in the firelight. Will you marry me? Sarah's breath caught, her heart swelling. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, pulling him to his feet and wrapping her arms around him. Yes, Stephen. Forever and always, yes. Their kiss was met with cheers from the boys, who quickly abandoned their marshmallows to tackle them in a group hug. Later that night, as the campfire dimmed and the boys slept soundly in their tents, Sarah sat with Stephen beneath the stars. Her hand rested gently on her stomach, a soft glow emanating from her palm. What is it? Stephen asked, noticing her distant expression. She turned to him, her smile radiant. There's something I need to tell you. I've been feeling an unexpected change. And tonight, the forest confirmed it. Stephen, I'm pregnant. For a moment, he was speechless, his eyes wide with surprise and joy. Then he pulled her close, his voice breaking with emotion. You're serious? Sarah, that's amazing. Sarah nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. This child is a blessing of both our worlds. A new beginning. As they sat together, the stars above and the forest around them seemed to hum with life, their futures intertwined in a way that neither had ever imagined. Thank you for listening. Please like the video and leave a comment if you enjoyed the story. More to come soon.